So as Georgia mentioned, my topic is called Embedding Micromobility into Greenfield's developments. I think it's a subject that probably doesn't get enough airtime. I'm fortunate to work with a lot of really experienced land use planners who work in the Greenfields industry. My presentation today is quite observational, talks about really some of the shortcomings of the way we roll out Greenfields developments in WA, but also some opportunities, how we can really turbocharge micromobility in these areas with a few little tweaks and drawing on best practice from interstate and overseas. So firstly, a little bit of a definition. What is micromobility? In my view of the world, and this is pretty consistent with the literature out there, micromobility are small devices, small, slow devices on wheels is probably the best way to describe it. They can either be human or electrically powered, either privately owned or shared, doesn't really matter for the topic of my conversation, and slow, all right? Most electric micromobility devices are meant to be limited at 25, but we know that some go a bit faster. And humanly powered ones, cap out around about 30 to 35 kilometres per hour. Why is this important? Who benefits from micromobility? I think the audience in this room gets all this already, so I don't need to dwell on it. Triple bottom line stuff, happier and healthier population, cleaner and greener environment, better communities, and a fairer, more equitable society. Some interesting research was sort of pointed to me recently from, I think it's the University of Melbourne or University of Victoria, around the cost of car ownership. And with recent inflation and higher interest rates, if a household can go from having 2 cars to 1 car, they can save up to nearly $20,000 a year once you factor in licensing, registration, insurance, depreciation, maintenance, and the big one for a lot of people, finance. $20,000 is a lot of money in anyone's books, and 3 or 4 years of going from a 2-car household to 1-car household can make a big dent in a deposit on a house. So it's important, micromobility. Okay, so by the way, I'm using a little bit of internet humour in this presentation. It's not all positive. My hypothesis really is that the way we cater for micromobility in greenfield situations in WA and around Australia more generally is no longer consistent with international best practice. It probably was once upon a time, but we are failing to keep up. And it all comes down to this simple idea. All ages and abilities. If a city works for, or it used to be called the 8 to 80 concept, if a city works for an 8-year-old child or an 80-year-old grandma, it'll probably work for everyone. We now call it the AAA philosophy. And it's beyond that. So if it works for those people, it probably works for a disabled person. It probably works for an economically disadvantaged person, or is more likely to work for them. So for AAA infrastructure to work, it needs to be safe, comfortable, and connected, or ubiquitous. It needs to enable people to travel to all their destinations. It's not just a recreational thing. It needs to be a transport thing, get you to the shops, school, work. So this is Emily, she's my niece, she's 8 years old. Think about someone like that when we look at some of the infrastructure. Okay, point 1. We can design our local streets better. Not every street in Australia can accommodate a bike lane, but they don't need to either. If we can get the speeds and volumes down low enough, people can quite happily share the road with cars, but they have to be really low. That's the trick. Most people are familiar with this idea that speed has a massive influence on the likelihood of survival in a crash. As a vulnerable road user, if you're hit by a car at 30 kilometres per hour, there's a 90% chance you'll survive. But if you're hit by one at 50 kilometres an hour, there's a 90% chance you won't. Massive difference between 30 and 50. What's often left out of this conversation is the impact that speed has on the likelihood of crashes. So due to reaction time and braking distance. Speed also influences the likelihood of crashes. And what's interesting, in the physics that sits behind both of these, you have a v-squared term. So small incremental increases in speed have large increases in the risk profile, both sides of the risk profile, likelihood and severity. But don't worry about the maths too much, just trust me, it's true. Okay, 30 kilometres per hour. It's established literature, it's international best practice. The good news is we're already kind of doing this in WA through the pioneering Safe Active Streets program. I posit that we need to take this philosophy further and embed it into entire neighbourhoods, network design. And it's not a radical idea, it's being done in other parts of the world, particularly in Europe. And we can redesign our local streets, and it's really easy in Greenfield situations, blank canvas, to achieve lower volumes and lower speeds through traffic calming, self-explaining street principles where we're not having to rely on police enforcement, and modal filtering, so making it compelling to undertake short trips using micromobility, not just possible. Big deal, low traffic neighbourhoods. Okay, point 2, unprotected bike lanes. This is not a real photo. Well, it's a real bike lane. It's here in Perth. It's obviously not a real, that lady's not pushing a pram there. This image was photoshopped by Tim Burns, he's here today, a fierce cycling advocate here in WA. But it highlights the absurdity of some of the bike lanes we've built. In what universe would a lady push her child in a pram in a bike lane like that? But we are desensitised to the idea that cyclists might want to use this. Certainly doesn't pass that AAA test I spoke about earlier. Can you imagine Emily cycling there? I don't really think it passes a safe systems test either, or I don't know how it gets through a safety and design workshop. This is a particularly bad example, but you can apply this thinking to a lot of the unprotected bike lanes we have around the place. So in Greenfield situations, we can do a lot better. This is an example that I came across recently from a relatively obscure place in Canada, a neighbourhood connector type road, protected bike lanes. This is 8 to 80 infrastructure, or AAA infrastructure, I should say. Point 3, shared paths. We do shared paths really well in WA. I have a hypothesis that has no evidence to back it up, but I reckon we have more shared paths, kilometres of shared paths per capita than anywhere else in the world. If someone from Curtin Uni could qualify that, that'd be handy. But we have an awful lot, and we're really good at delivering them. They've become almost the default standard for active transport in WA. And they do work, like most of the time, but not in every situation. And I think we've become a bit too over-reliant on them. Introducing separated paths, the next paradigm. And we're slowly but surely beginning to realise this. The Dutch have known this for about 40 years. You need 3 different networks to support the 3 different types of users. The big heavy things on wheels, big heavy fast things on wheels, the small light things on wheels, and the small light things on feet. They are 3 different user groups, and they deserve 3 different networks. So this is a real place. This is here in Perth, a development that my colleagues worked on down in Mandogalup, and this has an extensive network of separated paths, and this is really the gold standard. We should be moving from shared paths to this where possible. Point 4, I think. Footpaths. Not strictly micromobility, but I had to talk about it. We have some shocking footpath design in our Greenfields developments around the place. It took me 2 minutes to find this one on Nearmap. I didn't have to look very hard. Imagine you live in this house here. I don't know if that'll work. This house here. Or your child lives in this house here and their friend lives over the back fence. They have to cross the road 7 times to get to a house on the same block. It's insane. And and we've sort of conceded to the development industry in a lot of cases where we only strive for footpath on one side of the street. Other places around Australia mandate them on both sides on every street. It makes a big difference for network coherence. Also, backer curb footpaths result in these really awkward, annoying crossings at every intersection. We can do so much better. And in fact, you look at the old traditional neighbourhoods from around the place and we do it better. Older suburbs in Perth tend to have footpaths on both sides. They tend to have them on the property boundary, not on the curb line. They tend to have smaller intersection radii, which makes crossing the road both shorter and more direct. And finally, well, not finally, finally for this bit of the presentation, intersection design. This is missing the title of it. It's fallen off, that's okay. Don't give up at the intersection. We can design our signalised intersections better, our roundabouts better, and our side street intersections better. Now, this isn't just theory from the Netherlands or from a NACDO guideline. This is real-life stuff that's now getting rolled out in other parts of Australia. This is in Melbourne. This exists now, intersection of Lansdowne and Albert Street. There's similar intersections like this in Brisbane. There's a few of these in Melbourne and a bunch of them planned for Canberra, and loads of these being rolled out in Queensland. This is not theory anymore. We can up the standard here in WA as well. And here's a real life example. This is a development that my colleagues worked on in, where's this one? Victoria, Cloverton. You can immediately see some of the differences from that picture I showed earlier. Footpaths on both sides of every street, on the property boundary, not on the curb line. A separated path, not a shared path, a separated path on the neighbourhood connector with priority intersection treatments at the side roads and the big roundabouts can be done. And this, you look at a lot of Greenfields developments around Melbourne and they're like this now. By the way, we do other things in our Greenfields developments better than interstate. The built form product tends to be better here, but our street network design is falling behind. Similar example from Queensland. Separated path, priority intersections, priority footpath treatments at side roads. So what I'm trying to get at is that it's not a huge leap from where we currently are to develop a situation, a future, where every street is configured to support micromobility. And not just support it, but make it compelling for the 8 to 80 user group. Okay. So I think there's 4 key takeaways I've got here. We need to ensure that our infrastructure caters for people of all ages and abilities. We need to think in threes, 3 different networks of 3 different user groups on the higher order streets. We need to reduce speeds and volumes on the lower order streets where you can't actually fit the third part of the network. And don't give up at the intersection. This is critical. We need to improve our intersection design. So why is this all important? Because retrofitting micromobility infrastructure is really, really hard. Like, it's really slow and really expensive. And I reckon there's a lot of local government people in this room today, and probably consultants as well, who have lost a bit of hair over this and been beaten up by the community on trying to punch through infrastructure in brownfield situations. Let's get it right from the start. Another reason is because Greenfield's development, like it or not, is not going away anytime soon. Perth and Peel requires 800,000 new homes by 2050, over which half will be on the fringe in Greenfield's developments. Let that sink in. 400,000 new homes. That's a lot of streets and roads. That's 10 Ellenbrooks of development. So there's a lot of work to do, and we should be doing it better. And finally, we have an opportunity right now to influence the next generation of Greenfield development design, or policy, I suppose, guidance. Livable Neighbourhoods, it's been a great document, pretty pioneering when it first came out, is up for a refresh, and there's some great people working on this at the moment who I I know we'll be looking at these, a lot of these points I've been banging on about today. But as the advocates in this room, it's up to all of us to ensure that this thinking is embedded in the new version of this document, because I don't think the development industry is going to do it on their own. Thank you.